Nobody in the Hegemony talked about the naming convention out loud. That was the first thing Counselor Verith noticed when she took her seat on the high chamber floor for the first time, 40 years ago. There was a list pinned to the back wall of the chamber, half hidden behind a ceremonial banner that nobody ever moved. She had asked her predecessor what it was. He had looked at her the way an old man looks at someone who just asked why the lights are left on at night in a graveyard. "You'll understand later," he said, and walked away. She understood later. The list was called the Roster of Names. It was not officially a document. It did not appear in any Hegemony archive. No vote had ever been taken to create it, no committee had debated its contents, and no junior clerk had ever been asked to file it. It existed the way certain truths exist, quietly, permanently, in a place where everyone could see it but nobody had to say anything about it. Each name on the list belonged to a human, not a species. Not a delegation, not a diplomatic title or a cultural classification. Individual human beings, most of them long dead, each one attached to a fleet designation that the rest of the galaxy would never officially acknowledge existed. The Hegemony had 17 such fleets. 17 names. 17 humans. Verith spent the first decade of her tenure pretending she hadn't noticed. She was very good at pretending. It was practically a requirement for the job. But 40 years was a long time, and she was tired of pretending. The human ambassador's name was Dara Osei, and she had been in the position for 6 years, which made her one of the longer-serving human representatives the Hegemony had ever dealt with. Most humans cycled through the posting quickly. They found the pace of Hegemony politics exhausting. Centuries-long deliberations, procedural customs that required a doctorate to understand, social hierarchies so layered that even the Hegemony's own citizens sometimes forgot who was supposed to bow to whom. Dar didn't seem to find any of it exhausting. She seemed to find it interesting, which was, in Verith's experience, far more dangerous. They met in the counselor's private office, which was a room most people never saw. The Hegemony's public architecture was all sweeping curves and translucent stone, built to impress. Verith's office looked like somewhere a person actually worked. Stacks of memory wafers. A half-finished cup of something cold. A window that looked out onto the city's lower districts because she had always found the lower districts more honest than the upper ones. "You asked to see me," Dara said. She did not sit down until Verith gestured to the chair, which was correct protocol, but she also did not look nervous, which was unusual for anyone sitting across from a senior counselor. "I did," Verith said. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that I'm asking as an individual, not as a representative of this body. Whatever you tell me stays here." Dara nodded slowly. "All right. Have you ever heard of the Roster of Names?" The pause that followed was small. Barely a breath. But Verith had been watching people pause for 40 years, and she knew what it meant when someone paused like that, not from confusion, but from decision. "No," Dara said. "Should I have?" "Probably not. Most humans never do." Verith turned to look out the window. "But I thought it was possible that someone, somewhere in your diplomatic records, had mentioned it. A footnote. A rumor. Something passed down from one ambassador to the next. If it was, it didn't make it to me. Then I suppose I should explain it to you." The story of the Roster of Names began, like most things in the Hegemony, with a war. This was not the kind of war most species thought of when they heard the word. It wasn't a border conflict or a resource dispute or a political disagreement that had escalated past the point of diplomacy. It was older than that. It was the kind of war that gets a single-word name in historical records, the kind of name that, centuries later, still makes people go quiet when they say it. They called it the Hollow. The Hollow had started 400 years ago, before humanity had even developed faster-than-light travel, before humans had any idea that the galaxy was crowded. It had started when a species called the Vrethkai had decided that the universe would be tidier without the 37 other sapient species that were currently cluttering it up. The Vrethkai were not, by most metrics, impressive. They were not large. They were not technologically advanced beyond the average for their era. They did not have some unique biological advantage that made them particularly dangerous. What they had was patience and a very specific kind of madness, The kind that looks, from the outside, like complete calm. They had spent 200 years preparing, building fleets in secret, developing weapons in silence, mapping the locations of every inhabited world within their reach. And then, when they were ready, they had simply begun. Not declared war. Not issued ultimatums. Not given any of the warnings that, in retrospect, the other species might have used to prepare. They had simply begun erasing worlds. The hegemony at that point, Vareth said, was a coalition of 11 species. We had a combined military force that was, on paper, more than sufficient to deal with a threat like the Vrethkai. We had numbers. We had technology. We had resources. She paused. What we did not have was the ability to coordinate those things fast enough to matter. Dar was leaning forward slightly. She hadn't moved for the last several minutes. What do you mean? I mean that 11 species, when they are frightened, do not cooperate well. Each member of the coalition had its own command structure, its own tactical priorities, its own idea of which of its worlds mattered most and which could be sacrificed. When the Vrethkai attacked, the response was 11 separate responses, poorly timed, poorly communicated, and often actively working against each other. How many worlds did they take? Vareth was quiet for a moment. 14. Before we managed to organize a real resistance. 14 inhabited worlds. Gone. The words sat between them. We stopped them eventually, Vareth continued. After 9 years of fighting, we stopped them. But the experience left a mark on the hegemony that never entirely healed. The understanding that having strength is not the same as being able to use it. That a coalition of capable species can still be defeated if it cannot act as a single body when it needs to. And the roster of names is connected to that? The roster of names is the solution we found. Vareth turned back from the window. Or rather, the solution we were shown. 60 years after the Hollow ended, a human explorer ship called the Persistent Question became the first human vessel to make contact with hegemony space. It was not a diplomatic mission. The humans aboard had not known the hegemony existed. They had been doing what human explorers apparently did naturally, which was go somewhere nobody had told them to go and poke at whatever they found there. The ship's captain was a woman named Adiz Nwosu, and when the hegemony intercept vessel dropped out of faster-than-light travel in front of her and told her she was in restricted space, she had reportedly said, "That's interesting because we didn't see any signs." The intercept vessel's commander had been very confused by this response. Captain Nwosu spent 3 months as a guest of the hegemony while diplomatic channels worked out what to do with her and her crew. During those 3 months, she was given access to hegemony public records as a gesture of good faith. She read a great deal. She asked questions that the hegemony's officials found either very astute or very annoying, depending on who you asked. At the end of the 3 months, she submitted, unbidden, a 14-page analysis of what had gone wrong during the Hollow. Vareth had read that document. She had read it several times, in fact, across her 40 years on the council. It was not particularly long. It was not written in diplomatic language. Nwosu had the writing style of someone who had spent too much time alone with her thoughts and not enough time worrying about how those thoughts would land. The document's central argument was simple. The hegemony hadn't failed because its member species were weak. It had failed because command authority was fractured. Every species had been defending its own territory instead of fighting as a unified force. The solution was not more ships or better weapons. The solution was a single command structure, with a single decision-making authority that every member species trusted equally. The problem, Nwosu had noted in her typically blunt way, was that no existing hegemony species could fill that role. Any species given supreme military authority during a crisis would be viewed by the others as a potential conqueror. The fear was rational. The Hollow itself had started because one species decided it should be in charge of the galaxy. Handing emergency authority to any hegemony member would mean trusting that they would give it back when the crisis was over. And that trust, Vareth said, was not something any member of the hegemony could extend to any other member. Too much history. Too many old grievances. Too many instances of authority being claimed and not returned. So what did Nwosu suggest? She suggested using humans. The logic was, in retrospect, elegant. Humanity was new to the galaxy. They had no history with the Hegemony's member species, which meant they had no old wounds, no inherited grudges, no generation-long feuds that would color their decisions. They were not powerful enough to be a threat. Their territory was small, their fleet modest, their political influence essentially non-existent. Giving them command authority during a crisis would not be seen as handing power to a rival, because they were not yet a rival. And they had, as Nwosu had pointed out with characteristic directness, a particular talent. She called it operational urgency, Vareth said. The human ability to function under time pressure. To make decisions quickly and then commit to them completely. Most species, when facing a crisis of the Hollow's scale, slow down. There are consultations. There are procedures. There are committees formed to decide whether a committee is needed. A thin smile crossed her face. Humans do not do this. They assess, they decide, they act. And then they explain themselves afterward, if they have to. That sounds like it could also be a description of recklessness, Dara said. Yes. We thought the same thing. That was why the proposal took 40 years to actually implement. Vareth set her hands on the desk. But Nwosu's analysis was compelling, and it kept being compelling, and eventually the council agreed to a trial. The first trial had been a border dispute in the Kareth system, 20 years after Nwosu's report. Not a full war. A skirmish, really, between two Hegemony member species who had been arguing about mineral rights for a century. The Hegemony had been trying to mediate for 15 of those years with no progress. Both sides had started positioning military assets. They had brought in a human military advisor named Commander Efren Delgado and given him observational authority over the Hegemony's response force. Not command. Not yet. Just the ability to make recommendations. His first recommendation had been to move the Hegemony's primary response fleet to a position that, tactically speaking, made no sense by conventional doctrine. He had put it directly between the two disputing parties, close enough that any hostile action by either side would almost certainly draw a response. The Hegemony's generals had been horrified. It was exactly the kind of aggressive, non-diplomatic positioning that could escalate the situation catastrophically. Both disputing parties had backed down within 6 days. He understood something our commanders didn't, Vareth said. Both sides wanted a way out that didn't look like backing down. By positioning the fleet where he did, he gave them an excuse. They weren't retreating from each other, they were responding to a new variable in the situation. They could go back to their people and say the Hegemony had intervened, as if the intervention was the point. It let both of them save face. That's not a military tactic, Dara said. That's theater. Yes. Humans, Vareth said, seem to understand theater very well. After Delgado, there had been others. A series of human advisors, military specialists, emergency commanders, people brought into Hegemony operations in roles that were always described as temporary, always described as advisory, and always turned out to matter more than anyone had planned for. Each one had left a mark, not just on the operations they'd been part of, but on the Hegemony's institutional memory of how to handle a crisis. Methodologies that got absorbed into doctrine. Approaches that, when they worked, got quietly incorporated into training programs under different names. But the real shift had come 70 years ago, during an incident that the official records listed as a significant containment operation, and that everyone who had actually been there called the Keth Corridor. There was a species, Vareth said. The Marin. You won't find them in any current records because they are gone now, and the Hegemony was not, technically, involved in what happened to them. But the Marin were, in certain ways, similar to the Vreth-Kai. Not in goals, the Marin had no interest in exterminating anyone. They were, by most measures, a reasonable species. What they had was a technology, a weapon, something they had developed in isolation over centuries and that, when they tested it for the first time, produced effects that nobody, including the Marin themselves, had fully anticipated. What kind of effects? The kind that do not stay contained, Vareth said simply. The test site was a small moon in the outer territories. Within 3 weeks, the effect had spread to 2 neighboring systems. The Marin were attempting to shut it down, but they did not know how. They had never intended to deploy it at that scale. The Hegemony's science teams were working on solutions. Committees were formed. Reports were generated. Proposals were submitted for review. She stopped. The effect was spreading at a rate that would reach inhabited space in 11 weeks. Dara said nothing. A human commander named General Yuki Tanaka was, at that time, attached to a Hegemony fleet in the region on a joint training exercise. She had no authority over the containment operation. She had no formal relationship with the science teams. She was technically a guest. Veritha's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. She requested a briefing, which she was given out of courtesy. She read the reports. She looked at the projections. And then she went to the fleet commander and said she had a solution. What was the solution? She wanted to collapse the 3 transit corridors feeding the expansion of the effect. The corridors were, essentially, the pathways through which it was propagating. Closing them would not stop it, but it would reduce its spread rate to something manageable while the science teams worked on a real fix. The problem was that collapsing a transit corridor requires destroying the anchor stations at each end, which are extremely expensive pieces of infrastructure that the Hegemony had spent decades building. She wanted to blow up Hegemony infrastructure. 6 stations. Each one worth more than the combined annual GDP of most mid-tier member species. The pause. She also wanted to do it in the next 48 hours, before the committee reviewing the containment proposals had finished reading the executive summary. The corner of Dara's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. What did the fleet commander say? He said no, obviously. This was a decision that required council authorization. It was a decision that required scientific review. It was a decision that potentially affected 3 separate member species whose territorial claims intersected with the corridor locations. It was, in short, a decision that would require months of deliberation even under ideal circumstances. And Tanaka? General Tanaka, Verith said, went back to her quarters and spent 6 hours building a case. Not an emotional argument. Not an appeal to urgency. A case, documented, sourced, systematically addressing every counter-argument she had been given. She presented it to the fleet commander at 0300 in the morning. He didn't approve it. He didn't, but he passed it up the chain. It reached a senior counselor, not me, my predecessor, who read it at 0700 and authorized emergency provisional authority. Verith looked at her hands. The stations were destroyed at 1400 that same day. The effect was contained. The science teams had it fully neutralized 8 weeks later. The room was quiet. The formal review afterward lasted 2 years, Verith continued. There were serious questions about whether emergency provisional authority had been granted correctly, whether the decision had been within the counselor's power to make, whether the cost had been justified. The counselor who authorized it spent a significant portion of the rest of her career defending it. Was it the right call? Verith looked at her directly. 11 inhabited systems would have been affected if the effect had not been contained when it was. The scientists' estimates, in hindsight, were conservative. The real figure was probably closer to 15. Another pause, longer than the ones before. Yes. It was the right call. After Tanaka, the Hegemony had stopped pretending that human involvement in its military operations was temporary or advisory. The formalization had been done carefully, quietly, in the way the Hegemony did everything it didn't want to make into a public discussion. A series of protocols. A series of agreements. A series of provisions, buried in larger documents, that collectively added up to something that had never been explicitly stated, that in certain categories of crisis, a designated human commander would have authority that superseded the normal chain of command. Not permanent authority. Not total authority. A specific, defined scope, activated only under specific conditions, with a specific process for review and termination. And attached to each protocol, a name. A human name. Someone who had been evaluated, vetted, trained in hegemony procedures, and given the codes and the authority to act if the conditions were met. 17 protocols. 17 conditions. 17 names. The names on the wall, Dara said. The names on the wall, Verith confirmed. Some of them are people who are still living. Some of them served and are gone. When one dies or retires, the name is replaced. The list is maintained. The protocols remain active. Dara was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was careful. Does the person whose name is on the list know about it? Yes. We do not do it without consent. There is a process. An evaluation. An offer. Most who are offered it accept. And the ones who don't? There are other names. There are always other humans. Verith said it without bitterness, just as a fact. That is one of the things we have come to understand about your species. There is always another one willing to step forward. The afternoon light had shifted while they talked, moving across the floor in a slow diagonal. Dara was looking at the window, not through it. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because one of the names on the list has asked to be removed. She has served for 12 years and she is ready to stop. Verith opened a drawer and placed a single document on the desk between them. And because the evaluation committee has submitted a recommendation. Dara looked at the document. She did not pick it up. The recommendation is for you, Verith said. Dara Osei did not give an answer that day. She asked for time, which Verith granted. She asked for access to the files associated with the existing protocols, which took 2 weeks to arrange because the files were, technically, classified above the level of any human diplomat currently serving. She asked for a meeting with the woman whose name she was being asked to replace, which required another 3 weeks of scheduling because the woman, a retired general named Solange Beaumont, was living on a research station in the Outer Territories and did not travel much anymore. Verith granted all of it. She was patient. She had been patient for 40 years. The meeting with Beaumont happened on a neutral platform, a Hegemony way station that served as a stopover for long-haul cargo routes, the kind of place that was always busy and never crowded, full of people passing through and nobody staying. They met in a small room that smelled like recycled air and the particular kind of quiet that comes from being very far from anywhere important. Dara had prepared questions. She had written them down and then rewritten them, trying to find the right level of directness. She had wondered, in the weeks since Veritha's office, whether there was a way to ask what she needed to ask without sounding like she was looking for a reason to say no. In the end, Beaumont made the questions unnecessary. She was a small woman with close-cropped gray hair and the specific kind of stillness that Dara had seen in people who had spent a lot of time in high-stakes situations and learned, eventually, that stillness was better than movement. You want to know if it was worth it? Beaumont said, before Dara had said anything beyond hello. I want to know what it actually is, Dara said. Verith gave me the history. The documents gave me the structure. I want to know what it feels like to be the person whose name is on that list. Beaumont looked at her for a moment. Do you know what the protocols are triggered by? The documents said, Category 7 events or above. Do you know what a Category 7 event is? Something that threatens multiple inhabited systems simultaneously. Something, Beaumont said, that the Hegemony's normal command structure cannot respond to in time. That's the real definition. Not the scale, the timeline. A Category 7 is any threat where the response window is shorter than the decision-making process. She paused. In 12 years, I was activated twice. What happened? The first time was a cascade failure in a transit network that was going to cut off supply lines to 11 systems during a resource shortage. It sounds administrative. It wasn't. It was the kind of situation where, if certain decisions weren't made within 72 hours, you were looking at civil breakdown in 3 of those systems within 6 months. The Hegemony had committees reviewing it. The committees were doing exactly what committees are supposed to do. She stopped. I made 4 decisions in 48 hours. 2 of them were wrong. 2 of them were right. The 2 that were right were enough. And the 2 that were wrong? One of them cost a significant amount of money to fix. One of them cost 3 people their lives. Her voice did not change. I have thought about those 3 people every day for 12 years. Dara absorbed this. And the second activation? The second one was a first contact situation. A species emerging into FTL capability, encountering Hegemony space unexpectedly, with both sides having incomplete information and a hegemony patrol fleet that had reacted in a way that could very easily be interpreted as aggression. She looked at her hands. I had about 6 hours to prevent what would have been, at minimum, a serious incident and at maximum a war. What did you do? I ordered the patrol fleet to stand down, surrender their weapons to standby mode, and transmit a sequence of mathematical patterns to the new species ships. Communication. A gesture of non-threat. The pause. It was a guess. I don't speak their language. I don't know their culture. I looked at what I had and I made a guess. And? They transmitted back. We spent the next 40 hours in improvised communication, and then proper diplomatic teams arrived. She looked up. The hegemony has a new member species now. They've been in the coalition for 4 years. The room was quiet except for the distant sounds of the way station going about its business. Why are you leaving? Dar asked. Because I'm tired, Beaumont said simply. Not physically. I'm tired in the way that you get tired when you've been carrying something heavy for a long time and it's time to put it down. She looked at Dara directly. The list doesn't end. It keeps going. Someone's name is always on it. That's what you need to understand. It's not a burden you carry and then set down when you're done. You set it down by handing it to the next person. That doesn't sound like an argument for accepting it. It's not. It's just the truth. Beaumont leaned back. Here's the argument for accepting it if you want one. In 12 years, I made decisions that the hegemony couldn't make for itself. Not because I'm smarter than the counselors. Not because I'm braver. Because I'm human, which means I'm not part of their system, which means I don't have their paralysis. The things that slow them down, the history, the old grievances, the procedural obligations that were written to prevent one species from dominating the others, they don't slow me down. I can act. And when you're wrong? Then you're wrong. And you live with it, and you try to do better next time, and you hope the next time matters more than the time you were wrong. She paused. There is no version of this where you're not sometimes wrong. The question is whether you being wrong sometimes is better than the hegemony being paralyzed always. Dara flew back from the way station with the documents in her bag and Beaumont's words in her head. She spent 2 days not reading the documents and then spent one very long night reading all of them. The protocols were, as Verith had suggested, carefully constructed. The scope of authority was narrow, specific categories of emergency, specific time windows, specific review processes. There were oversight mechanisms. There were provisions for the authority to be revoked if it was used outside its defined boundaries. What struck her was not the authority itself but the structure around it. The hegemony had spent a long time thinking about this. Not just building the protocols but building the safeguards, the reviews, the limitations. They had thought about what could go wrong and they had tried to prevent it. It was not, she thought, the work of a body that was trying to hand off responsibility. It was the work of a body that had thought very carefully about the difference between authority and trust, and decided that trust was the rarer and more valuable thing. She sent a message to Verith. Not an answer, not yet. A question. She asked why humans specifically. Not in the historical sense, she had understood that from the beginning. But in the present sense. There were, at this point, several species in the hegemony that were relative newcomers, without the old histories that tied the original members to each other. Why not one of them? Why keep the roster limited to humans? Veritha's response came the next morning. It was not a long message. The counselor was not someone who used words when she didn't need to, but it said something that Dar read 3 times before she put the tablet down. The other new species are learning to be part of the hegemony. That is what newcomers do. They learn the systems, the customs, the ways of thinking that have developed over centuries. Most of them are very good at this. After a generation or 2, they are indistinguishable from the older members in how they approach problems. Humans are not learning to be part of the hegemony. Humans are learning the hegemony and then remaining themselves. We have been trying to identify why this is for 6 decades. We do not have a complete answer. But the effect is real and it is useful, and we believe it would be lost if humans were fully integrated into the existing structure. The roster is not a limitation. It is a preservation. She said yes 3 weeks after the meeting with Beaumont. The formalization was a quiet process. A series of meetings with Hegemony military liaisons. A series of technical briefings on the protocols, the communication systems, the command structures she would theoretically be activating. A medical evaluation. A psychological assessment that she suspected was more thorough than it appeared to be. And then a ceremony, which she had not expected. It was not a public ceremony. It was held in a room she had never been in before, in a part of the high chamber complex that was not on any official map she had been given. The room was plain. Stone floors, no windows. A single overhead light. Verith was there, and 2 other senior counselors she had met in her years as ambassador, and a military official whose title she didn't recognize. There was a plaque on the wall. Not the list she had heard described. This was something older, the original version, stone rather than whatever material the current list was made of. She could not read the Hegemony script, but she could count the names, and there were more of them than she'd expected. Not just the 17 active slots. The old ones, going back to Nwosu, going back to Delgado, going back to Tanaka and every human who had carried this thing and then handed it forward. You will understand the significance of what is being asked, the military official said. It was the formal opening of the ceremony, and she could tell it was a recitation, the same words said every time. I understand it, she said. You will carry this authority with the knowledge that it may never be needed, and you will remain prepared as though it will certainly be needed. I will. You will act within the bounds of the protocols, and you will accept review and judgment for actions taken under this authority. I will. And you will understand that this authority is not given because you are trusted more than others, but because you are different from others, and that difference is what makes you useful. She had thought about this line in the days before the ceremony. It was, on the surface, not a particularly flattering thing to say to someone during a formalization ceremony. You're useful because you're different, not because you're better. But she had read Veritha's message 3 times, and she had sat with Beaumont in that room that smelled like recycled air, and she had spent 2 days not reading and 1 long night reading, and she thought she understood what the line actually meant. I understand, she said. She was ambassador for 3 more years before the first activation. The crisis was not what she had expected, which was probably the first lesson. She had spent 3 years thinking about Category 7 events in terms of the dramatic scenarios in the briefing documents, existential threats, cascading failures, the kinds of things that appear in historical records as turning points. She had not thought much about the scenarios that don't make it into historical records because they're prevented before they become historical. The activation came in the middle of a normal working day. A communication on the protocol channel, the one that went directly to her personal device, that she was never supposed to use for anything else. A code that she had memorized in the first week and hoped she would never need to use. The situation was this. 3 Hegemony member species had each, independently, moved military assets to the same region in response to what each of them believed was a threat from one of the others. The movements had been triggered by misread sensor data, a technical error that had already been identified and corrected. The problem was that all 3 fleets were now in a configuration that, from inside any of the 3 species command structures, looked exactly like the other 2 preparing to attack. They had been in that configuration for 4 hours. In 2 more hours, based on the communication patterns the monitoring systems were tracking, at least one of the 3 would have given the order to fire. The Hegemony's diplomatic channels were active. Communiques were being sent. The senior diplomatic corps was involved at the highest level. The problem was that the senior diplomatic corps was a hegemony body, and each of the 3 species was watching the others and the hegemony's diplomatic response with equal suspicion, because that was the situation they were in. Dara read the briefing in 4 minutes on her way to the protocol communication room. She had 5 channels open simultaneously when she sent her first communications, not to the commanders, but to the navigators. Not orders to stand down. Not diplomatic language. She transmitted, on an open channel that all 3 fleets could see, a coordinate set. A place. Not a neutral location. Not a point equidistant from all 3 fleets. A location that was, technically, inside the territorial boundary of one of the 3 species, the smallest one, the one with the least military weight in the standoff. She then sent a single-line message on the same open channel. I am positioning the Hegemony observer vessel at these coordinates. Any fleet that fires will be firing in the direction of a Hegemony diplomatic envoy. She did not have an observer vessel to position. The Hegemony didn't have assets in the region that were close enough. But the statement went on the open channel, which meant all three fleets heard it, which meant all three fleets now had to account for a fourth party in their calculations. The largest of the three fleets demanded confirmation from the Hegemony Diplomatic Corps. The Diplomatic Corps, she knew, would take approximately 40 minutes to respond through official channels. In those 40 minutes, all three fleets held position. In 43 minutes, a ceasefire communication arrived from one of the three species, citing the presence of a Hegemony diplomatic envoy as the reason for de-escalation. The other two followed within an hour. She was in the protocol communication room for a total of 6 hours. The formal review took 2 months. She spent a significant portion of those 2 months answering questions about the legality of representing, however implicitly, that a Hegemony asset was present in a location where no Hegemony asset existed. Her answer to those questions was consistent. The communication had been technically accurate. She had stated that she was positioning the vessel. The positioning had not yet occurred at the time of the communication. It was a statement of intent, not a false representation of fact. The review board had not been entirely satisfied with this answer. But the three fleets had not fired, and 19 Hegemony worlds were in the affected region, and the board had, in the end, classified the action as within the bounds of the protocols. Verith had sent her a single message after the review concluded. It said, "Tanaka would have liked you." The second activation came 8 months later, and the third 8 months after that, and by the end of her 5th year on the roster she had stopped counting activations and started thinking about them as a feature of the position rather than exceptions to it. She was, by then, 6 years past her initial appointment as ambassador. The diplomatic posting had been extended and extended again, partly because the Hegemony preferred continuity and partly because, as Verith had said privately, having the roster's active name in the ambassador's chair created an unusual efficiency. She thought about Beaumont sometimes. About the research station in the outer territories, the small woman with the gray hair, the way she had said, "I have thought about those 3 people every day for 12 years, without changing her voice." She had her own weight now. Not 3 people, she had been fortunate in that. But mistakes, and the way mistakes sit with you differently when they happen under authority. When you made a decision as an individual and it was wrong, there was a clear locus of responsibility. When you made a decision under emergency authority, the responsibility was still clearer, in some ways, but the weight was distributed differently. It spread into the past, to the protocols that had given you the authority, and into the future, to whoever would carry this thing after you. The list was not a list of individuals. It was a chain. Each name connected to the names before and after it, all the way back to Nwosu on her explorer ship, poking around in space she hadn't been invited into and writing a 14-page report nobody had asked for. 8 years into the posting, Verith retired from the senior council. The retirement ceremony was the kind of formal occasion that the Hegemony did very well, long, procedurally complex, full of speeches that were themselves procedurally complex. Dara sat through all of it, which she had gotten better at over the years. Afterward, at the reception, Verith found her in a corner near a window, which was exactly where Verith would have expected to find her. "I have a question," Dara said, before Verith could speak. "The one I never asked. The one I've been sitting with for 8 years. Verith raised an eyebrow. "The roster of names. The protocols. The whole structure." Dara looked out the window at the lower districts, the same view she had first seen from this building 8 years ago. The Hegemony built this to solve a specific problem. The problem of paralysis. The problem of a coalition that can't act fast enough when it needs to. Yes. But the reason the coalition was paralyzed wasn't just procedural. It was because the member species didn't trust each other. The history, the old grievances, all of that. She paused. Has it gotten better? In the time the protocols have been active. Has the trust improved? Verith was quiet for a moment. Around them, the reception continued. 100 conversations in a dozen languages, the particular texture of a formal gathering near its end. Yes, she said finally. Slowly. Not because of the protocols directly, but because they exist. Because the member species know that there is a mechanism, and the mechanism has worked, and the mechanism is held by someone who is not one of them. She paused. It turns out that the most trust-building thing the hegemony has ever done is hand authority, temporarily, to someone who had no stake in any of the old fights. Because if I abuse it, I'm not stealing it from my species. I'm just wrong. And a mistake is survivable. A betrayal is not. Vareth looked at her with something that had been building, Dara thought, for 8 years. Not quite pride, Vareth wasn't the type. But something adjacent to it. The mistake makers are listed on the wall too. All of them. Including the ones who made significant mistakes. The hegemony did not remove their names. Why not? Because the wall is not a list of people who were perfect. It is a list of people who accepted the weight and carried it as well as they could. The pause. That is all it has ever asked. Dara Osei served on the roster of names for 14 years. She was activated 11 times. In 8 of those activations, the outcome was unambiguously good. In 2, the outcome was mixed. Decisions made under pressure that were defensible but not optimal, things she reworked in her head for years afterward, refining the version of herself that would do it differently. In 1, the outcome was simply bad, a mistake that cost something that couldn't be recovered, that she accepted the review for and acknowledged and added to the weight she carried. When she handed the protocols to the next person, a young man named Marcus Vale, who had been flagged by the evaluation committee for reasons that Dara, having read the evaluation, thought she understood, she sat with him in a small room that smelled like recycled air and told him the truth. It's not about being special, she said. That's the thing that seems obvious from the outside but isn't actually what it is. It's about being outside. Being the person in the room who doesn't have the old reasons to hesitate. Who can look at a problem and ask what needs to happen instead of who will be blamed if it goes wrong. And when I go wrong? He asked. He was younger than she had been, and she could see in him the same thing Beaumont had probably seen in her, someone who had agreed to something they didn't fully understand yet. Then you go wrong, she said. And you live with it. And you try to do better. And eventually you hand this to someone else, and the list gets one name longer. He nodded. He looked at the plaque. The old one, stone, with the names going back to Nwosu. Why do they keep the old names? He asked. Not just the active ones. All of them all the way back. Dara thought about this. She had thought about it for 14 years, and she had an answer now that she hadn't had at the beginning. Because the hegemony is old, she said. It has been making decisions for centuries. Most of those decisions were made slowly, carefully, with full deliberation and proper procedure. And most of the time, that's right. Most of the time, slow and careful is exactly what's needed. She looked at the names. But the hollow happened. And the Keth corridor happened. And 11 times in the last 14 years, something happened that slow and careful couldn't address in time. So the names are a reminder. The names are a reminder that there is another way. That it exists, that it has been used, that it has costs and that those costs have been worth it. She looked at him. And maybe more than that. They keep the names because the names are people. Not a policy. Not a procedure. People who stood in a specific place at a specific moment and made a decision that the system couldn't make for itself. That's terrifying, he said. Yes, she said. That's exactly what it is. The roster of names, as of the current cycle, contains 17 designations. Each designation is attached to a specific category of emergency protocol, each protocol tested and reviewed and updated as the hegemony changes, as new member species bring new considerations, as new crises suggest new failure modes. The names on the roster are not announced publicly. They are not known to most of the hegemony's population, or to most human diplomatic corps, or to most of the decision-making bodies that would, in a Category 7 event, defer to the person whose name is on the relevant list. The wall in the high chamber still has the original plaque, still half hidden behind a banner that nobody moves. The current roster is maintained on a different medium now, Technology has changed as technology does, but the plaque remains. There are 63 names on it. Going back, with gaps and amendments and the occasional note in the margin that even fluent hegemony scholars find difficult to parse fully, to the name at the beginning. Adis Nwosu, the plaque reads at the top of the list. Below it, in smaller script, a note that was added sometime in the early years and has never been removed. She told us the truth when we didn't want to hear it. That is, in the end, what the hegemony learned to value most. Not the strength. Not the speed. Not even the decision-making, though all of that was real and necessary and had, on 11 occasions in 14 years and many more before that, made the difference. It was the willingness to say the thing that needed to be said. To look at a problem that a system couldn't solve for itself and say, here is what needs to happen. To be wrong sometimes and right enough of the time and carry the weight of both. The names on the wall are not monuments. They are not tributes. They are, in the most accurate sense of the term, a record of the times the hegemony looked at a crisis it couldn't navigate alone and found a human willing to stand in the gap. And always, always finding one.